The year was 1887, and the silence of the high plains was the only thing Arthur Prescott owned in abundance. It seeped into the chinking of his cabin walls, settled like dust on the cold hearth, and filled the space beside him in his narrow bed. His ranch, a lonely scratch of civilization against the vast Wyoming sky, was a testament to labor, not to life. The fences were taut, the barn was sound, and his cattle were healthy, but the house itself held its breath, waiting for a life that had ended before it truly began. 5 years. It had been 5 years since Eleanor was buried on the small rise overlooking the creek, the same place they had once planned to build a larger home. Their infant son, unnamed and unbaptized, lay beside her. The doctor from Laramie, a man with weary eyes and whiskey on his breath, had been blunt in his own grieving way. "Some women are not made for it, Arthur," he'd said, his hand a heavy, useless weight on Arthur's shoulder. "And some men, well, a seed needs fertile ground, but it must be a good seed to begin with." The words had planted themselves in Arthur, a bitter root of shame that had grown deeper and stronger than any grief. He was the barren ground. He was the end of the line. So he worked. He threw himself into the unforgiving cycle of the seasons, using exhaustion as a shield against memory. He broke horses, mended fences, drove his herd through blizzards and drought, all with a grim, silent efficiency that the few other ranchers in the territory mistook for strength. They saw a man hardened by loss, a man content with solitude. They did not see the ghost who sat at his table, the phantom cry that woke him in the deepest part of the night. They did not see the hollowness that labor could never fill. His life was a routine of survival, a long, monotonous march toward nothing. He was checking a section of fence line along the southern edge of his property when he found them. At first, he thought it was a bundle of rags caught in the sagebrush, discarded by some passing wagon. But then the bundle moved, a weak, almost imperceptible shift. Arthur dismounted, his hand resting warily on the stock of the rifle sheathed to his saddle. The land was unforgiving, and so were many of the people who crossed it. As he drew closer, the rags resolved into the form of a woman, curled into a tight ball. She was native, her dark hair matted with dirt and her deerskin dress torn and thin. Her face, when he gently turned her, was a mask of gaunt exhaustion, her lips cracked and bleeding. She was little more than a skeleton draped in skin. But it was what she clutched to her chest that made Arthur's breath catch in his throat. Wrapped in a tattered blanket was a baby, its face tiny and pinched, its breathing a shallow, rasping sound that was more terrifying than a scream. The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were black, deep-set, and filled with a terror so profound it transcended any fear of him. It was the fear of a mother who knew she was failing. Her arms tightened around her child, a last, desperate act of protection. She tried to speak, but only a dry croak emerged. Arthur looked at them, then at the vast, empty horizon. He could ride on. It was not his affair. It was the way of things in this hard country. People died. He knew that better than most. To involve himself was to invite a complication he had spent 5 years avoiding. It was to let the world, with all its pain and its need, back into the fortress of his solitude. But the baby's faint whimper cut through his resolve. It was a sound he had longed to hear in his own home, a sound that now represented a life hanging by the thinnest of threads. He looked at the woman's fierce, desperate eyes, and he saw not a stranger, not an Indian, but a mother. It was a language he understood in his very bones. He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of the last 5 years. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "All right." He unstrapped his canteen from his saddle and knelt. He uncorked it and gently, carefully, brought it to the woman's lips. Water was the first promise. The second, he knew, would be far more costly. Getting her back to the cabin was a slow, arduous process. The woman, he did not know her name, and did not ask, was too weak to walk. Arthur had to lift her onto his horse, her body feeling as light and fragile as a bundle of dry sticks. She never loosened her grip on the child. He walked beside them, his hand steadying her on the saddle, the familiar weight of his rifle now feeling alien and useless against the profound vulnerability he was leading home. Section flews. The cabin felt smaller with them in it, the silence immediately broken. Arthur settled her on a pallet of blankets he made near the hearth, the warmest part of the room. He worked with a brusque efficiency, building up the fire, putting a pot of water on to boil for a thin broth. He tried not to look at them too much, feeling like an intruder in his own home. This was Eleanor's space, his space, a sanctuary of memory. Now it was a sick room. The woman, whose name was Winona, watched him. Her gaze was constant, unblinking, a silent assessment of his every move. She did not trust him. He saw it in the way she flinched when he moved too quickly, the way her hand flew to her child if he came too near. He couldn't blame her. In her world, a man like him was likely a harbinger of violence, not salvation. He held out a cup of warm, salted broth. "For the boy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He made a small gesture with his chin toward the infant. Winona hesitated, her eyes darting from his face to the cup. Then, with painstaking slowness, she shifted the baby, whose name was Chaitan, and took the offered cup. Her hands trembled, spilling some of the precious liquid. She didn't drink it herself. Instead, she dipped her finger into the broth and gently touched it to her son's lips. Over and over, she repeated the tiny ministration, a ritual of desperate hope. Arthur watched for a moment, an ache tightening in his chest, before turning away to busy himself with meaningless chores. The first few days passed in a tense, shared silence, marked only by the rhythm of care. Arthur chopped wood, cooked meals of broth and thin porridge, and left them on the hearth. He kept the fire going through the cold nights, often sleeping in his chair rather than his bed, listening to the twin sounds of the woman's soft murmurs and the baby's labored breathing. Chaitan's condition worsened before it improved. A fever took hold, leaving his small body slick with sweat. His cries became weak and reedy, a sound that frayed Arthur's nerves. Winona did not sleep. She bathed her son's face with a damp rag. She sang to him in a low, melodious language that filled the cabin with a sorrowful beauty, and she held him. She simply held him, as if her own life force could be willed into his. One night, the baby's breathing grew so shallow it seemed to stop altogether. Winona let out a strangled sob, a sound of pure despair that shattered the cabin's quiet. Arthur was on his feet in an instant. He saw the panic in her eyes, the complete surrender to hopelessness, and something inside him broke. "No," he said, the word a command. He knelt beside them, his usual caution gone. "Give him to me." For a heartbeat, Winona clutched the baby tighter. Her eyes, filled with tears, blazed with defiance. But then she looked at Arthur's face, at the grim determination there, and she saw something other than a threat. She saw a shared, desperate will for this child to live. With a shuddering breath, she relinquished her son into his hands. Arthur's hands, calloused and rough from years of leather and wood, felt clumsy and huge around the tiny infant. He carried the baby to the table, his heart hammering against his ribs. He remembered something his own father had done once for a newborn calf born too soon in the dead of winter. He filled a basin with lukewarm water and another with cool water from the barrel. Gently, he unwrapped Chaitan from his blanket and began to sponge him, alternating between the two temperatures. The shock was meant to stimulate, to force a deeper breath. It was an act of raw, animal instinct, a farmer's remedy, not a doctor's science. Winona stood behind him, her hands pressed to her mouth, watching. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the soft splash of water. For a long minute, nothing happened. The baby remained limp, his skin frighteningly pale. Arthur felt a cold dread wash over him. He was a fool. He had taken this woman's last moments with her child and turned them into this crude experiment. Then Chaitan gasped, a deep, shuddering intake of air, followed by a thin, protesting wail. It was the most beautiful sound Arthur had ever heard. A wave of relief so profound it made him dizzy washed through him. He looked down at the crying infant in his hands, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt something other than the dull ache of loss. He felt a fierce, wild surge of protectiveness. He wrapped the baby warmly and handed him back to Winona. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that felt charged with 1,000 unspoken words. She took her son, her face streaked with tears, and whispered a word he didn't understand, but he knew it was thanks. That night, the fever broke. The crisis had passed. A fragile bridge had been built between them in the dark, held together by the life of a child. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the cabin began to change. The tense silence slowly gave way to a quiet coexistence. Chayton grew stronger, his cheeks filling out, his cries becoming more demanding. Winona, too, regained her strength. The gaunt hollows in her face softened, and her movements became less fragile, more assured. She began to contribute to the household in small, unobtrusive ways. One afternoon, Arthur came in from the barn to find a neat patch sewn onto his torn work shirt. Another day, the scent of wild mint, which she had gathered from the creek bed, filled the room. She began to prepare their meals, taking the flour and dried beans he provided and turning them into simple, savory stews, far more palatable than his own grim fare. She never asked for permission, she simply saw a need and filled it. Their communication remained sparse, a mixture of gestures and single words. She had a small grasp of English, enough for necessities. Water, more wood, he sleeps, but they began to learn each other's rhythms. He learned that she liked to sit by the window in the early morning light, watching the sun rise. She learned that he always paused by the mantelpiece before he left for the day, his hand hovering for a moment over a small, silver-framed photograph of a smiling woman that he kept there. One evening, as he was cleaning a piece of tack, he watched her play with Chayton on the floor. She was tickling his belly with the end of her long braid, and the baby was gurgling with a delight so pure it made the whole cabin feel warm. A ghost of a smile touched Arthur's lips. Winona looked up and saw it. Her own smile faltered for a moment, surprised. "He has a good laugh," Arthur said, his voice quiet. She nodded, her eyes soft. "He has your quiet," she said, searching for the word, "but his heart is loud." Arthur looked at the boy, who was now trying to grab the shiny buckle on his mother's belt. He saw the resilience in him, the simple, uncomplicated will to live. He felt the bitter root of his own inadequacy twist inside him. This boy, a stranger's son, was thriving in the house where his own son had never drawn a breath. "My son," Arthur started, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. He never spoke of it, never. He stopped, unable to continue. Winona's gaze was steady, filled with a deep, knowing sorrow. She didn't press him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply met his pain with a quiet understanding that was more comforting than any words could have been. In that shared glance, he felt a fissure in the wall of his isolation. He was not just a provider, and she was not just a refugee. They were two people who had known profound loss, sharing a roof and the warmth of a fire. The cabin was starting to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. The need for supplies eventually became unavoidable. The flour sack was nearly empty, and he was low on coffee and salt. The trip to Harmony Creek was one Arthur dreaded. He had avoided the town, and the pitying or judgmental looks of its inhabitants, for months. Now, he had a new reason for apprehension. News, like wildfire, traveled fast on the plains. A lone rancher taking in a native woman and her child was not the kind of news that would go unnoticed. He left at dawn, leaving a larger portion of jerky and cold biscuits than usual. "I will be back by nightfall," he told Winona. She simply nodded, her expression unreadable, and pulled Chayton a little closer to her. He knew she was afraid, and the knowledge settled like a stone in his gut. Harmony Creek was just as he remembered. A single, dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place that always felt smaller and meaner than the land around it. As he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, he could feel the eyes on him. Mr. Callahan, the store owner, gave him a curt nod as he entered. "Prescott," Callahan said, wiping the counter with a dirty rag. "Been a while." "Need flour, salt, coffee," Arthur stated, avoiding pleasantries. As Callahan weighed out the flour, a shadow fell across the doorway. Arthur didn't need to turn to know who it was. Garrett Vance was a man who owned the biggest spread in the county and acted as if he owned the county itself. He was barrel-chested and florid-faced, a man whose confidence was born of bullying and coin. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Vance boomed, stepping inside, flanked by two of his ranch hands. "Arthur Prescott, thought you might have turned to dust out there on that lonely patch of yours." Arthur ignored him, counting out coins onto the counter. Vance sauntered closer, his spurs jingling with self-importance. "Heard you got some company, Prescott," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sneer. "Heard you're running a private reservation out there. Took in a stray squaw, did you?" Arthur's hand froze over the coins. The air in the store grew thick and still. Callahan suddenly found something intensely interesting to organize on a shelf behind him. "My business is my own, Vance," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. "Not when it affects the rest of us," Vance countered, stepping directly into Arthur's path. "We don't take kindly to that element around here. They steal, they bring trouble. You got no right keeping her on your land. It ain't decent." Arthur slowly raised his head, his gray eyes meeting Vance's. The people in town saw a quiet, grieving man. They had forgotten the man he was before Eleanor, a man who had carved a life from this hard land with nothing but his own two hands and a stubborn refusal to be broken. That man was looking at Garrett Vance now. "She is under my protection," Arthur said, each word as solid as a stone, "and on my land. That makes it my right." Vance's face darkened with anger. "This ain't over, Prescott. Some of us think a woman like that and her little half-breed brat belong at a fort where they can be dealt with properly. You'd be wise to hand her over before someone decides to come and collect her." The threat hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Arthur gathered his sack of flour, his movements deliberate and calm. He walked past Vance without another word, the force of his cold fury creating a space around him that even Vance's bluster couldn't penetrate. As he mounted his horse, he knew his ride back would be much faster than his ride in. The peace of his ranch had been shattered. The world he had tried so hard to shut out was coming for him. And it was coming for them. He rode hard, the rhythmic beat of his horse's hooves a frantic counterpoint to the pounding in his own chest. The fear he felt was cold and sharp, but it was mingled with something else, a white, hot, protective rage. Vance's ugly words echoed in his mind square, "brat." They were not talking about an abstract element. They were talking about Winona. They were talking about Chayton. When he saw the thin curl of smoke from his cabin chimney against the bruised twilight sky, a profound sense of relief washed over him, followed immediately by a fresh wave of anxiety. He had brought this trouble to his own door. His act of charity had become a beacon for the ugliest parts of the world he had tried to escape. Winona was waiting just inside the doorway when he entered, a rifle held loosely in her hands. It was his spare Winchester. He had no idea she even knew how to use it, but the way she held it told him she was prepared to. Her eyes were wide with fear, but her stance was resolute. She had seen the riders coming. They arrived less than an hour later, 5 of them, led by Vance. They reined in their horses just beyond the reach of the lamplight spilling from the cabin door, their forms dark, menacing silhouettes against the dying light. "Prescott," Vance's voice cut through the evening calm. "We've come for the squaw and her spawn. Send them out." Arthur stepped out onto the porch, his own rifle in his hand. He didn't raise it, just held it at his side. He planted his feet, feeling the solid wood beneath him. He was a man who had lost everything he ever thought he would build on this land. He would not lose this. "They're not going anywhere, Vance," Arthur called back, his voice steady and clear. "You're on my property. Turn around and ride away." "Don't be a fool, Prescott," another man shouted. "This ain't your fight." "You're on my land, threatening people under my roof," Arthur replied, his voice ringing with an authority he hadn't felt in years. "That makes it my fight." He could feel Winona standing just inside the doorway behind him, a silent, unmovable presence at his back. He could hear Chayton's soft cry, quickly shushed. In that moment, the cabin behind him was not just a structure of wood and mud, it was the entire world. Vance dismounted, taking a step forward into the light. His face was a mask of self-righteous fury. "We are here to uphold the decency of this community. You are harboring a savage. It is our duty. She is my wife." The words left Arthur's mouth before he had fully formed them in his mind. They fell into the tense silence, stark and irrefutable. Vance froze mid-step, his mouth falling slightly open. His men shifted in their saddles, murmuring to one another. Arthur felt a tremor go through him, the enormity of his declaration settling in. It was a lie, a desperate gambit born of necessity. But as he stood there, feeling the weight of Winona's presence behind him, the lie began to feel like a different kind of truth. It was a claim, a vow. He took a breath, letting the lie settle and grow into something stronger. "This is my wife, Winona," he said, his voice gaining strength, "and that is my son in her arms. You are threatening my family. Now, I am telling you for the last time, get off my land, or so help me God, I will consider it an attack on my home, and I will defend it accordingly." He raised his rifle then, not aiming it, but holding it across his chest, a final, unbreachable barrier. There was no wavering in his stance, no doubt in his eyes. He was no longer the town's grieving recluse. He was a husband and a father, defending his own. Vance stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. He saw none. He saw only the cold, hard certainty of a man who had drawn a line in the dirt and dared anyone to cross it. A man's family, even a strange one, was a sacred thing in this country, protected by law and by custom. To attack it was to invite a blood feud, a level of trouble even a bully like Vance was hesitant to start. With a curse, Vance spat on the ground. "You're crazy, Prescott," he snarled. "You'll regret this." He turned, swung himself back onto his horse, and without another word, wheeled the animal around. His men, looking confused and suddenly less brave, followed suit. They kicked their horses into a gallop and disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the sound of receding hoofbeats and a cloud of dust. The silence that descended was deeper and more profound than any that had come before. Arthur stood there for a long moment, the rifle heavy in his hands, his knuckles white. The adrenaline slowly ebbed away, leaving him trembling. He turned and went back inside, barring the door behind him. Winona was standing exactly where he had left her, the spare rifle now resting against the wall. Her face was pale in the lamplight, her dark eyes searching his. The air between them was thick with the echo of his words. "She is my wife. That is my son." He leaned his own rifle against the wall and ran a hand over his face, feeling the bone-deep weariness of the confrontation. He didn't know what to say, how to explain the lie he had just told. "Arthur," she said. It was the first time she had ever spoken his name. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper. He looked at her. She took a step toward him, then another. She reached out a tentative hand and laid it on his forearm. Her touch was light, but it grounded him. "The lie," he started, his voice hoarse. "Vance," he wouldn't stop. "I had to." "It was not a lie," she interrupted softly. Her gaze was unwavering. "You stood for us. You named us. You made a shield with your own body. In the eyes of my people, that is the act of a husband, the act of a father." Arthur stared at her, the simple, profound truth of her words washing over him. He had acted to protect them, and in doing so, he had forged a bond far stronger than any law or ceremony could provide. He had created a family not out of law or blood, but out of choice and defiance. Chayton, awakened by the tension, began to fuss. Winona went to him, lifting him into her arms and rocking him gently. Arthur watched them, this woman and child who had drifted into his life like tumbleweeds and had now taken root in the very center of his heart. The cabin no longer felt like a monument to what he had lost. It felt alive. From that night on, everything was different. The lie they told the world became their quiet truth. They never spoke of it again, but it settled between them, a foundation of mutual respect and shared fate. The guarded distance disappeared, replaced by a comfortable intimacy. They moved around each other with the easy grace of people who belonged together. Life settled into a new rhythm. Arthur worked the ranch, but his labor was no longer a grim, solitary penance. He was working for them. He would look up from the fields and see Winona in the garden she had started, or see Chayton taking his first wobbly steps in the yard, and a feeling of deep, quiet contentment would fill him. She brought life to the home in countless ways. She hung dried herbs from the rafters, their scent mingling with the smell of baking bread. She mended his clothes, her stitches small and neat. She would sing her low, beautiful songs to Chayton, and the melodies would drift out of the open door, filling the lonely plains with a sound of peace. As Chayton grew from a baby into a boy, Arthur found himself becoming the father he never thought he would be. He carved a small wooden horse for the boy, its form rough but made with love. He let Chayton ride in front of him on the saddle, the boy's small hands clutching the pommel, his eyes wide with wonder at the vast world. He taught him the names of the constellations and how to track a deer. He never forgot the son he had lost, the child of his blood buried on the hill. The grief was still there, a part of the landscape of his soul. But it was no longer a desolate wasteland. Now, it was a valley where new things could grow. He would sometimes stand on that hill, looking at the two small graves, and then turn to watch Winona and Chayton by the creek, and he understood that love was not a finite resource. A heart could break and still have room to grow again, larger and stronger than before. One evening in late summer, years later, he sat on the porch steps, watching Chayton, now a sturdy boy of 6, trying to skip stones across the creek. Winona came and sat beside him, leaning her shoulder against his. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, a language they had perfected. "He looks like you when he is thinking hard," she said softly. Arthur watched the boy's brow furrow in concentration. "He has your patience," he replied, "and your strength." He knew what the world saw when they looked at them: a broken rancher, a displaced native woman, and a child of mismatched blood. But here, on this small patch of land carved out of the wilderness, they were simply a family. He was a man who had believed himself to be a dead end, a barren tree. But he had become a protector, a husband, a father. His legacy wouldn't be in the name Prescott passed down through blood, but in the love and safety he had built with his own 2 hands, for a woman and a child he had found starving on a lonely trail. He had offered them shelter, and they, in turn, had given him back his life. He had found his heir not in his body, but in his heart. And in the quiet expanse of the Wyoming twilight he knew, with a certainty that settled in his very soul, that he was the richest man in the world.